No one wanted the Apache girl in shackles. Until the outlaw chief cut her chains, the desert did not forgive weakness, and it did not forget cruelty, and that was why the crowd had gathered in silence beneath the burning Arizona sun, their boots grinding dust into the earth, as if they were trying to bury something that refused to die. And at the center of that circle stood the girl they had already decided was worthless, her wrists raw inside iron shackles that bit into her skin every time she moved, her dark hair tangled by wind and captivity, her chin lifted not in pride but in stubborn refusal to bow to the men who stared at her as if she were livestock at auction, and they called her many things, wild thing, trouble blood, cursed child of the mountains, but they would not call her by her name, because to speak her name was to admit she was human, and humanity was something they were determined to strip from her as thoroughly as they had stripped her tribe of land, water, and dignity. And though she stood barefoot on scorching dirt, her ankles chained, her throat dry, there was a fire in her eyes that unsettled even the harshest among them, because fire meant spirit, and spirit meant resistance, and resistance was dangerous. Her name was Ayana, though no one there cared to remember it, and she had been taken at dawn 3 days earlier when soldiers stormed the ravine where the remaining Apache families had been hiding. And she had fought, oh, she had fought like a storm breaking against stone, biting, clawing, striking with a broken branch until a rifle butt had caught her across the temple and sent her into darkness. And when she awoke she was bound, wrists chained, thrown onto a wagon like cargo, and she listened as men discussed her fate, not as if she were a living being, but as if she were an inconvenience, a problem to be transferred, traded, or discarded. Now she stood before settlers and traders who had been summoned under the pretense of opportunity, because cruelty often wore the mask of business, and a heavy-set man in a dusty coat cleared his throat and announced in a voice meant to sound official that the girl was unclaimed, unwanted by her scattered kin, and available for indenture, labor, or whatever arrangement might remove her from military custody without further expense, and he said it as if he were doing someone a favor, as if shackles were generosity and survival was charity, and a few men chuckled while others avoided looking directly at her, because looking too long into her eyes made something uncomfortable stir in their chests, something like guilt. But no one stepped forward, not the rancher with cracked hands, not the merchant with calculating eyes, not even the woman who whispered that perhaps the girl could be trained into obedience. They saw trouble in her posture, rebellion in the way she refused to lower her gaze, and fear disguised itself as practicality as they shook their heads one by one, muttering about temper and risk, and the danger of keeping someone whose spirit had not been properly broken. And so she remained there in the circle, rejected not because she lacked strength, but because she possessed too much of it. The officer's patience thinned beneath the sun, and he grabbed the chain at her wrists, jerking it sharply so she stumbled forward, her knees striking dirt, and a murmur passed through the crowd, some satisfied, some uneasy, but Ayana did not cry out. Not when gravel tore her skin, not when the iron bit deeper, because she had already decided that if they meant to destroy her, they would have to do it without hearing her beg, and there is a kind of power in silence that unnerves tyrants more than screams ever could. Last chance, the officer barked, no one wants her. Silence answered him. And then came the sound that did not belong to the scene, the slow, deliberate rhythm of hooves against hard earth, approaching not in haste but in certainty, and the crowd parted instinctively before they even saw him, because men who live by fear can recognize something greater than their own, and through the parted ring rode a figure clothed not in uniform nor in settler's dust but in the weathered leathers of someone who belonged neither to law nor to submission, his presence carrying the quiet authority of mountains that had watched generations rise and fall, and whispers began. Before his boots even touched the ground, the outlaw chief. They had other names for him too: Ghost of the Canyon, Rebel Wolf, Traitor to Treaties, but none dared speak them loudly, because the man who now dismounted with measured calm had made a habit of rewriting outcomes that powerful men thought were already decided, and he walked forward without asking permission, his gaze sweeping once across the circle before settling on the girl in chains, and in that moment something shifted, subtle yet undeniable, as if the desert itself leaned closer to watch. He did not look at her the way the others had. He did not assess her like merchandise or threat. He saw her. Ayanna met his eyes, and for the first time since her capture, the weight pressing against her lungs loosened just enough to allow a full breath, because in his stare she did not see contempt nor pity but recognition, the kind that passes between warriors who understand what it means to stand alone against overwhelming force. And though she did not know his name, she knew instinctively that he was not here to claim her as property. The officer straightened, irritation flickering into caution. "This is military matter," he said stiffly, "unless you've come to purchase." The outlaw chief tilted his head slightly, as if considering the absurdity of the word, and then he stepped closer, boots stirring dust around Ayanna's knees, and he reached not for a coin purse, not for paperwork, but for the chain itself, his fingers brushing the iron with deliberate calm, and the officer bristled. "Careful," he warned. "Careful," the chief repeated softly, and there was something in his tone that made even the wind pause. "You parade a child in irons beneath open sky and speak to me of care." A few in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. "She's trouble," the officer snapped. "No one wants her. Take her if you're so inclined. Saves us the burden." The chief's eyes flickered once more to Ayanna's bruised wrists, to the dried blood at her temple, to the fierce, unbroken fire she still carried despite everything designed to extinguish it, and then, without flourish or announcement, he drew the blade at his side, not in threat, but in purpose. And before anyone could fully process his intent, the metal edge came down hard against the chain. Sparks flashing as iron split under force and precision, the shackle snapping open with a crack that echoed across the desert like a gunshot of defiance. Gasps rippled outward. Ayanna's wrists fell free. For a heartbeat no one moved. The officer's hand hovered near his pistol, uncertain whether outrage outweighed caution, and the chief met his gaze evenly, blade still in hand but angled downward, a silent declaration that he sought no blood today yet feared none either, and something in that stillness, something ancient and unyielding, made the officer reconsider the cost of escalating the moment, because this was not man who would retreat once challenged, and the crowd, sensing the fragile balance, held its collective breath. "She's under my protection now," the chief said, voice steady as canyon stone. No proclamation, no dramatic speech, just a statement of fact. The officer weighed pride against consequence, and pride lost, because there are battles that can be won with bullets and others that cannot. And after a long, brittle silence, he stepped back, muttering about paperwork and liability, signaling to his men with a reluctant gesture that this confrontation would not continue, and one by one the tension eased, replaced by murmurs that carried equal parts resentment and reluctant admiration. Ayanna remained kneeling, wrists free but trembling from sudden release, and the chief crouched before her, not towering, not commanding, but meeting her at eye level, and he extended his hand not to seized but to offer, and though trust was a luxury she could scarcely afford, she saw no deceit there, only an invitation to stand on her own feet rather than be dragged to them, and slowly, with dignity intact, she placed her hand in his. He pulled her upright. The desert wind rose as if applauding. And as they walked away from the circle that had so easily dismissed her existence, leaving behind the stunned faces of those who had chosen indifference over courage, Aeona understood something she had not dared hope for since dawn 3 days earlier, that being unwanted by the cruel did not mean she was worthless, that rejection by the fearful did not define her fate, and that sometimes all it takes to shatter a cage is one person willing to stand between oppression and its intended victim. Behind them, whispers would grow into stories, and stories into warnings, because the outlaw chief had not merely cut iron that day. He had cut the illusion that power belonged exclusively to those who wielded authority, and in doing so he had altered the trajectory of a girl the world had already discarded. Ahead lay uncertainty, pursuit, and conflict that would test them both. But as the sun dipped lower and their shadows stretched long across open land, Aeona did not look back at the place of chains.